I introduce my panelists, who I will ask also to introduce themselves. So Mike, Emil, Jonathan, please come up and join me. Let's have a pause for it. But I think it's just the most efficient way to proceed here. I'd like to ask each of my panelists to give in a nutshell who they are, what their interests they're representing, and what their concerns are, and then I'll ask some questions and we'll try to have a conversation here in the time that we have.
Perfect. Thank you. My name is Emil Sayegh. I'm the CEO of Hostway Corporation, and we're a hosting provider, 10 data centers across the world. We have a enterprise complex hosting business, as well as a shared hosting business, and we're very interested in net neutrality and making sure the chips fall in the right place. We have hundreds of thousands of customers that we want to make sure will get the proper treatment on the internet and a fair treatment on the internet.
Right. My name is Jonathan LaCour. The SVP of Product and Technology at DreamHost. We are celebrating our 20th year in business this year, which is pretty significant. We've got about 400,000 customers. And we are very interested in the topic of net neutrality as well, because we passionately believe that our customers deserve the freedom to know that they can share their content and have it be delivered on equal footing with anyone else on the internet. We're big believers in the open internet. We're also strident defenders of free speech. You may have seen us in the news lately in our fight with the Department of Justice. So we are willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that net neutrality stays a thing.
And I'm Mike Nelson. I do public policy around the world for Cloudflare. How many people know Cloudflare? Okay, I assume most people do, particularly after the last couple of weeks. I've been working in internet policy for almost 30 years, since I worked with Senator Al Gore in Washington. I worked in the Clinton White House on telecom policy and internet policy. Back then we had a very simple motto, which was first, do no harm. Of course, we also wanted an open and free internet. I've been working on that for 30 years. Cloudflare is dedicated to free speech and an open internet, but we want it done right. And I've seen too often in my time in Washington where good intentions lead to very bad regulation, which leads to even worse results. And so I think most of our discussion today probably will be about how do you get it right so that we have the kind of internet we've had so far, one that fosters innovation, competition, and free choices for customers everywhere.
So I've been reflecting about net neutrality a lot, especially as the Commission has maybe changed direction a little bit here in the United States. And also I know, as I said before, that regulators around the world are all watching each other and they're trying to figure out how they handle network neutrality. But I was thinking back to the first piece I ever tried, when I first tried to write about net neutrality, which must have been 2005, I wrote a piece and I said, well, I want network neutrality in the sense that I don't like providers making too many content decisions for me. I would like to make my own content decisions, but at the same time, I think I knew enough about the different layers of the stack to know that there were different kinds of content made different demands. Video makes a different kind of demand from email. And so I was thinking that through, and I said, well, we don't want it to be medium specific necessarily. Maybe we want some bandwidth tiers, or we want to enable platform providers and intermediaries to distinguish their services. And that was sort of my first gesture at the topic. And of course, one of the things that I think we've seen in the public policy debate is people maybe blurring those issues together. So sometimes some services demand more bandwidth or demand they put different kinds of demands on infrastructure and intermediaries than others do. And I wonder how you guys respond to that and when the network neutrality issues are resurfacing as they are today.
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, the hosting industry is kind of caught in between multiple forces, and we have to essentially protect the interests of our customers. You have the big content pushers that are out there, and then you have the telcos that want to tax that, right?
Right.
And tier it. And from our perspective, just like Jonathan said, we want to make sure that the small guy also has the same rights as the large content pusher. But here's the key thing: also telcos need to be able to make money somehow, right? Something, I think, a compromise, and we got to let Congress legislate. I mean, they got to do their job. We can't be doing stuff via executive order, because the executive order is going to get overturned and back and forth, and it's going to whipsaw our industry and our customers. My humble opinion is that we got to look at this as a toll road, and all cars pay the same exact fee. All trucks pay the same exact fee. No deals can be cut between trucking companies and the toll road provider. Whether it's one truck that's owned by one company or a fleet of trucks, everybody pays the same toll. We got to be able to kind of get to some kind of a compromise like that that allows everybody a equal access to the internet.
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think everybody agrees with that in principle. One of the things I think about is that when I use a carrier like the U.S. Postal Service, or I use a carrier like Federal Express, when I send bigger and heavier packages, I pay a different rate.
A lot more.
And also if I want it faster or slower, I pay a different rate. So I don't know if that informs our understanding in the telecom internet intermediary world, but it's one of the things I think about. But we still want them to carry everything that we give them, right? We don't want them to turn me down because I'm Mike and we don't like anything that Mike Godwin wants to send. That would be bad, I think. But maybe you guys want to respond to my question, and also maybe to the earlier question as well.
I think it's a lot. To me, it's all comes down to ensuring that it's a level playing field, that no one is getting an unfair advantage based upon some asset that they have or control in perhaps maybe even a monopolistic way, right? And we want the telcos to make money. That's important. If they don't, the internet isn't here, right? But most consumers have very little choice when it comes to how they get network in their home. Usually 2-3 choices at most for broadband connectivity. So it really is, the market doesn't have much choice at that end of the spectrum. And at our end of the spectrum, we want to make sure that they can make money, but we also don't want to suppress the ability for someone to have the ability to participate on the market of the internet, right? And if the market of the internet is going to be successful, it has to be level enough that a new entrant can come in and innovate without fear that they'll get just crushed by an unfair advantage. So to me, it's kind of separating the fabric of the network from the innovation on top of it, right? You shouldn't be able to flex your muscle about how much of the fabric of the internet you control to hurt innovation at one layer above, if that makes sense.
Mike, do you have anything to add?
I'd like to talk a little bit about communicating this issue. Before joining Cloudflare, I was a visiting professor of internet studies at Georgetown University in the Communication, Culture, and Technology program. And we spent a lot of time talking about how you communicate about technological developments. I think in this area we've done it completely wrong. Network neutrality is a phrase that just doesn't really describe what we're after. What we're after is what you said, non-discriminatory treatment of similar services. Somehow, network neutrality for some people has come to mean every bit treated exactly alike. And as Mike said, that doesn't make sense. There are cases where I might have a heart monitor. I want the handful of bits from my heart monitor to get through in a very reliable, fast way. And I don't care if somebody else's porn video doesn't get delivered as fast and as reliably. And we shouldn't have this ideology that the internet is neutral in whatever way it's framed. There are about 5 different ways that people describe this neutrality, and that's where the confusion comes in. We have zero rating, where some particular mobile carriers have said, we'll provide certain video services and it won't count against your data cap. Some of the advocates for net neutrality say that's not fair. Other people say that CDNs aren't neutral. So they're not just talking about ISPs, they're starting to move up the stack. So there's a lot of fuzziness in this term neutrality. If we focus on the real point, which is not discriminating between like services and your point, not abusing your situation and your control of the end customer, then I think we're going to be in a much better place. I always say the answer to the question is competition, innovation, and transparency. What's the question? That's what we really need here. If we have 5 or 6 choices on how we connect to the internet, some wired, some wireless, we're going to have network neutrality. We're going to have a non-discriminatory internet, because none of those 5 carriers are going to be stupid enough to only offer part of the internet or to discriminate against services that people want. The problem, I see it, is we've had 20 years of regulation, which in some cases has held back competition. Some of it's local regulation. So a city decides we're only going to allow the cable companies one conduit, and they only can dig up the street one time, so we're creating a monopoly at the local level. There are other laws at the state level that block new entrants into markets. That's what we need to fix first, and if we had spent our time and energy opening up markets rather than fighting this net neutrality debate, I think would be in a much better shape. I can talk later about what's going on internationally, but that's, I think, the other big issue we have. And what's happening overseas is even worse than what's happening here, as governments like Korea are stepping in and completely distorting the marketplace and disadvantaging companies that aren't one of the top 3 carriers there.
So actually, it's interesting that I'm going to bookmark and actually expand on that bullet point about international stuff, because one of the things that actually has fed back into my understanding of the U.S. and domestic market was my work with, I visited India, and I actually visited 3 different cities and talked about zero rating, which is essentially subsidized access for a range of services that could either be defined by some approval process, which people don't like, or by meeting neutral criteria, which people like a little bit better. And in India, the interesting thing to me was that the public policy debate about net neutrality and common carrier principles as they apply to the internet and who can invest in what were actually driven by policy activists, all of whom lived in pretty well-connected urban areas. And so what I always think about is, what about the 500 million to 1 billion people in India who are not connected even to one provider, or if they are connected, it's impossibly expensive. How do we incentivize the building of infrastructure? And that's a different kind of last mile problem than sort of the last mile problem considered generically. Because if you're in a city, in a suburb, your last mile, a lot of infrastructure is maybe already there, at least for 1 or 2 or 3 providers if you're in the United States. And the same is true for a lot of other developed countries. But in rural areas, even in the United States, there are access problems. And the question is, because we want the platform providers and the internet access providers to be able to make money, what does that regulatory regime look like, where they're able to make some money and generate, and they're not the low-hanging fruit of the city users anymore. They actually have to invest more to get fewer people in, but there are public policy reasons we want to have everybody connected. So I want to hear sort of your response.
I mean, in rural United States, you have different providers, right? There are different providers. There are RLECs and CLECs that are in these areas that actually are subsidized. They're subsidized, and in return for that subsidy.
It's not commonly recognized, not always universally recognized that they are subsidized.
Yeah, they are subsidized, and those subsidies are going down for sure. That money's going down, but they are, in return for that subsidy, they have to deliver service, even if the branch is 50 miles from the nearest house. Yeah, exactly. In North Dakota, South Dakota, so on and so forth. So in the United States, I mean, I think that that problem is separate. It's not on the Comcast, it's not on the Time Warners, unless they want to go into a certain geography, right? And they're not touching these geographies. So I think they're focused on the big metro areas, and I think the United States has solved that problem in a little bit of a different way than the rest of the world, where you got government-backed monopolies that deliver service to the entire country. So,
And
yeah,
of course,
sorry.
no, I'm not interrupting you. I'm actually, and of course, I'm just interpolating here. Smaller countries have a different geography problem than big countries that cover a lot of landmass. So that's another issue.
Very true. Very true. So I think the big providers are focused on the big metro areas, and we got to keep that in perspective and make sure that definitely they make money, but at the same time they treat everybody fairly. And if they have a similar service to a competitive service that they're charging internally the same way they're charging externally, they cannot use their position as a large company and then say, oh, okay, now we're going to subsidize our own video service and then put Netflix out of business, or deprioritize Netflix in our network versus our own video service. We just have to be very careful with that, because there's a lot of evil that can come out of that.
Good points. And I think, on top of that, what Michael was saying earlier about if you have enough competition, if you have adequate competition, no provider is going to be dumb enough, right, unless they all collude together, which is a different issue, right? That's another place the government has to step in. But if you have enough choice for the consumer, you're going to have a provider, or all of the providers are going to be smart enough to behave well, right? Or at least they're driven and incentivized to behave well, because then consumers will pick the best behavior, right? The market will correct there. The big problem is, like, if you talk about these rural areas, I mean, I don't think there's enough choice in pretty much any market in the US, right? You're talking 2, 3 choices at most. In order for that to become true, I think it needs to be a lot higher than that, 5, 6, 7, 8 choices. And if you're going to a rural area, good luck with that, because it costs a massive amount of money to put the infrastructure in to drive this, broadband kind of connectivity. I think wireless has an opportunity to kind of shift this. The technology is getting there. But we also, this is where the government has to step in, right? Fundamentally, they have to help create the incentive for people to serve all of these customers, right? And to do it in such a way that the market will more self-regulate on behavior, and also have some hard stops in place. And
But you
that's the dance.
can't regulate a market to ensure competition.
No, you
have
can't.
to build a regulatory environment that creates competition.
Right,
And
exactly.
what worries me about what the Obama team did, and I was on the tech team that helped get Obama elected. One of the problems with where they ended up was they were taking an Old Testament type approach to net neutrality. They were going to tell people exactly what to do to achieve net neutrality. That was outdated from day one. It's a bit like morality, right? We want everybody to be moral. One approach is to tell people exactly how to act. The other is to create an environment where, when they misbehave, there are consequences. And that's what our CEO wrote in a blog 2 years ago when the FCC went forward with its Title II approach. He really said it was just backwards. It was the right goal, but the wrong way about it.
Well,
let's hope we can get the Congress to do things right.
Right. And the Congress is, of course, really good at that.
We have nothing to fear. We're in good shape.
Yeah, I know. Congress is back in session, so I'm sure this will be worked out. But one of the things, but you said it was like from day one, but actually it's really more like from day 2000 or 7000 of the Obama administration, because what was actually happening is that you saw in the different leadership at the Federal Communications Commissions efforts to not use the strongest superpowers that the FCC as a regulator has. So there were efforts to explore other ways to regulate that. Now, there's certainly a lot of back and forth about how much intervention the FCC should do in terms of ensuring competition and ensuring fairness of treatment. But there were different sort of statutory remedies and superpowers that the agency has. But then, interestingly enough, as I think we know, and many of you know, the president spoke out on the issue, and there was some sense within the commission that, okay, we're going to go ahead and use not just the Flash's power or Green Lantern's power or Batman's power, we're going to use Superman's power and really use all the superpowers that we've got to put a network neutrality framework in place. And one of the things I've noticed in talking certainly to Chairman Pai at the commission and talking to current commission staff members is that it's not a pro-neutrality versus anti-neutrality discussion, at least at this point. It's more like, do we want to use the superpowers version, or is there a lighter touch framework that gets us to the goals of competition and transparency? And if that's true, what does that look like? And so although after the election, incoming Chairman Pai, who of course had served as a commissioner in the minority party during the Obama administration, is now the chairman, Republican chairman of the FCC. He was initially, we're going to roll back the open internet order, and he was very critical of the 2015 order, 2015 regulation. But one of the things that I see in how the question has been framed is that they actually are inviting opportunities for constructive alternative suggestions. And so I want to hear maybe what you think, if you want to talk about what that might look like.
I'm going to start by saying I'm a cyber libertarian, techno-optimist Democrat. There aren't a lot of us, but we do have a Facebook group.
That sounds like a panel.
You can join our Facebook group.
That sounds like a panel in and of itself.
And I'm optimistic enough to believe that the Congress really might act here. Yeah. I was going to wear this hat that R Street, Mike's group, gave me a few months ago. Then I realized he should get to wear the hat. It's a red hat. It's got white letters, and it says, "Make Congress Great Again." We really need congressional action because we have to have a very high-level, very specific regime that allows the FCC to take action when there is clear misbehavior. We don't want to have any more court cases. We don't want to have the rules going back and forth every time the parties change at the FCC. And that does require congressional action. And there are some people up there who are responsible and want it to happen. If we can do that, we can finally get good policy. And good policy, according to Mike Nelson's metric, is when the number of billable hours for telecom lawyers in Washington goes down rather than goes up, which is what it's been doing for the last 20 years.
Well, I don't think that ever goes down. I mean, my experience. I
said I'm an optimist.
It's not like I'm billing by the hour, but my experience, and I know a lot of telecom lawyers, is that just about never happens. And it might happen under any regulatory regime. But one of the things I think that that is happening in this part of the discussion in the United States is some people are looking to the Commission to be a source of solutions. Some people are looking at Congress to be the source of solutions. I actually think, the way I think about this is that the process at the Commission, which is a rulemaking process, which has sort of been reopened, all these network neutrality regulatory questions, or a lot of these questions, is an opportunity for people to be heard and to have a lot of discussion about what the right framework looks like, but nothing prevents Congress from actually looking at that record and saying, we don't need to wait for the Commission to do this. And we maybe shouldn't wait for the Commission to do this, but in fact, we should find not merely a consensus, but ideally a bipartisan consensus about how to achieve some vision of network neutrality.
But they're not going to act unless the public puts some pressure on them. And right now, the public is sending all of its emails to the FCC.
Right.
22 million of them, supposedly, although most of them come from Russia or are generated by bots.
I don't think that's
If
true.
instead we were sending them to the Congress and saying, we're not going to vote for you unless you fix this, then we might have some action.
That's the long-term solution. I mean, that's the long-term solution, is that we got to get Congress to do its job, and create a permanent solution, because this is not sustainable.
We had a bipartisan solution in 2005. We had the Powell principles from the FCC. It's just that they weren't backed up by congressional action, so they were thrown out by the courts.
And us as an industry, I mean, we have a lot of power in going and talking to our representatives. We did it, right? I mean, we did it, where's Christian? We did it during, the PIPA and SOPA stuff, right? And that moved the needle. And
our customers are our greatest ally in this,
exactly.
Right? We have a massive amount of power through the number of people that we touch at the end of the day, right? They care about these things if you put it in language that they understand. And if you tell them how to act appropriately, they will.
We also have another tool, and that's the other piece of the competition, innovation, transparency triad. We have transparency now. We have a lot of tools to actually spot when bad behavior is happening. And that, in some cases, has actually motivated companies to behave better without any regulation. But it also means that with these sensors, we're going to be able to ensure that action is taken quickly by the FCC.
Well, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, because a lot of people said, well, first Mike said Congress, now he's saying the FCC.
No, the Congress has to enable the FCC.
I know. So this is actually kind of a weird public policy ecosystem where each process feeds into the other, and ideally that is a positive feedback process. Interestingly, the change that resulted from the 2016 elections in the United States, which is ultimately a change in the control of the Federal Communications Commission, illustrates the problem, because the Commission certainly has the autonomy to do exactly what it's doing, which is reopen a regulatory process that had been considered closed. Well, now we are further down that road. We're now rounding the bend in 2017, and the Commission and that process is not really subject to more input at this point. And so the Commission is going to chew on what it's got. But this is an excellent time for organizations like Fight for the Future and Access Now and other organizations that have solicited public input to ask their subscribers, to ask the people who are watching them for leadership to talk to Congress, because absolutely the members of Congress, our senators, our representatives, are responsive to feedback. And to me, one of the interesting things that is emerging this year is that network neutrality was not at the top of anybody's issue list in the last election cycle, which actually in some ways is kind of liberating, because it means that the parties have not drawn lines in the sand about where they could meet and figure out how to go forward. And that, to me, I think creates an opportunity for Congress to be able to get things done, but they need to hear from voters, and they need to hear from other stakeholders, including companies and including people in the middle and including the larger platforms and everybody, to invest in the time it takes to talk to your members of Congress and let them know how you feel.
Yeah, I'm nervous about the potential that they don't act, right? And then we get more heavy-handed FCC action, right? And again, it's this constant back and forth. It's bad for everybody. So I would like to be an optimist.
Okay.
Right? So maybe tell me how to be an optimist in this regard, right? I'm very curious about that. How we get this on the priority list for Congress, right? How do we drive it up that?
Well, actually, you may not want that. In the Clinton administration, there were only 2 of us at the White House who even knew how to use the internet,
Right.
And it was really easy to get the right
vice
policy.
president.
Yeah. Right.
Well, 3 of us: Tom Khalil and Al Gore and myself.
Right. But no, I think what we want to do is sort of describe how we think the process can go, I think that one of the things that we are worried about is not just that Congress will not act, but maybe there will be a particular abuse case. There'll be an outlier case which makes Congress all predisposed to act in a way that maybe we don't like. So, for example, there are a lot of players at different levels of the stack, and there are a lot of players, in the internet, commerce space, and so on. All you really need is some bad cases to drive some bad law. And actually, we talked earlier today about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and the efforts to impose obligations on intermediary providers to screen content and police content. And Mike Masnick talked about SESTA, which would impose, because of the problem of sex trafficking on the internet, impose obligations, mainly because of prostitution services on Backpage. They're basically one particular service provider was selling advertising space for sexual services, which are illegal in the United States, and that's actually driving Congress to say, oh, well, we should obligate everybody to be policing more content on the internet. But what does that mean for all of us if that happens? Do you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah.
Because that's a little bit like SOPA and PIPA, except it's prostitution instead of copyright infringement.
Right. I mean, look, I think the laws as they exist, if these things get flagged, we are all very conscientious. We have a process for that. They get taken down. If there's a judge's order, they get taken down. So on and so forth, right? I mean, we're all law-abiding, and if we judge that there's something that is against our terms of service or against the laws of this country or in the country that we operate, we act. I mean, we have teams that do that. But to ask us to police 500,000, did you say 500? We have
400,000, yes.
Yeah, we have the same. We have the same number, 500,000 customers. And frankly, God knows how many applications we have, how many websites.
It's untenable.
Yeah,
it's not.
Yeah,
not
it's
something
untenable.
we can do.
I mean,
Well, it's worse than that. If we started monitoring the traffic to all of our sites, in our case, we protect 6.5 million sites. We don't host people, but we protect them from DDoS attacks and deliver their bits more quickly. If somehow we had to monitor every bit, we probably would be on the hook for billions of dollars in damages on privacy lawsuits from the European Union and all the rest. I mean, there's some very strict privacy rules in Europe that would collide with this piece of legislation. It's easily the most misguided thing I've seen in 20 years of working in this area. And that says something. And it's taking down the most important law that we've passed in 30 years when it comes to the internet. Section 230 is like the foundation that makes the internet and user-generated content so successful.
And the difficulty here, I think, and you can tell me if this sounds right to you, the difficulty here is that if you open the door to extra new policing obligations for intermediary services at any level of the stack, then everybody else who has often legitimate concerns about real public policy issues can say, well, you already did it regarding prostitution and copyright infringement. Right. Why don't you do these other things too? Because we know you're a tech company and tech companies can do anything, right?
We spent 25 years convincing people with our marketing that we can do anything, we can do it for free, and we can do it tomorrow. And now governments in Germany and Korea and elsewhere are telling us to do that. And it doesn't work in the long run. It will not allow us to have the internet we want. I think we just need a little provision that says, if you try to undermine democracy by rigging the election or any election, then maybe that would be another thing that we should take action on.
Well, I think it's an interesting problem set for even the biggest players in the industry. It's a big problem set for Google and for Facebook because since they are well-capitalized companies, they actually know, they certainly can comply at least with some level of regulatory requirements. But then the question becomes, what does competition look like where you have people who are already successes in the market who can afford new regulatory burdens, but what about new entrants in these markets, whether it's social networking or search or something else? How does that play out? And then I think in the hosting space, where we have some pretty vigorous competition, I think there are some questions, about how is this going to favor the biggest players over the smallest players and the oldest players over the newest players? What do you think?
If the new legislation takes effect, is that kind of the question?
Yeah, sure.
I mean,
Answer any version of the question that you.
Yeah. I mean, if and it's a big if, this takes effect, that's going to be a huge burden, and it's going to favor certainly the established players and the well-capitalized players. The new entrants is going to become. It's going to be a big barrier to entry to create a policing force. I mean, you could do it via algorithm, you could do it via automation, so on and so forth. And I'm sure there are services that will pop up and will say, hey, look, we will audit all the content that's get posted. But here's the deal: is that this needs to be kind of an ongoing thing, because the customer that you onboard today might have very good content and they might have passed the mustard, and then tomorrow it gets changed. I mean, that's the nature.
Yeah. And none of us want to shirk our responsibility. Like, as a host, it's critically important that we have a huge responsibility to be a part of this open internet and to protect people's freedom of speech and to not police the content wherever possible, right? We have this obligation because we want to have these people have these freedoms, right? On the other hand, we also have an obligation to do the right thing, right? And to ensure that we're not participating in elections getting rigged, for example. So it's really, really complicated. And I think I've heard a lot of people, over the last, let's say, 6 months, hitting me up on Twitter or via email and saying, well, couldn't you just, right? And the answer to that question is almost always no, right? It's really, really complicated. And I think, when it comes to the way I view it, we will comply with the law, whatever that law happens to be. But I want to be sure that the law is such that it's not a huge burden on us, on our customers. It achieves the goal that it's set out to achieve. And I think people don't understand and recognize the nuance and the complexity that you highlighted. So, but we do have responsibility, right? So I think we should advocate that maybe, no, the status quo is not good enough, right? Maybe we should make a change. But we need to be very considerate about what that change is and be sure that we don't put ourselves in a position where we're all going out of business or people aren't able to communicate their views.
Mike, I'm going to apply a lesson I learned when I was setting up hearings in the Senate, and that is answer the question you wish the senator had asked.
Please do.
And that is about something we haven't talked about, which is interconnection. When we complained about what the FCC did, we devoted a few paragraphs to what we considered the most outrageous thing, which was a few paragraphs that said, oh, and maybe there's some unfair practices happening in interconnection, and we're not sure what we're going to do, but maybe we'll have to regulate interconnection.
So that was in the 400-page.
It was.
The 400-page order and regulation, but there were a few paragraphs.
But in terms of amount of uncertainty per paragraph, that was
pretty big.
By far the highest generator of uncertainty. And it was particularly odd because we have such a competitive market in interconnection in the US. The really odd thing, though, is...
Because everybody's incentivized to interconnect.
Well, because there's choices.
Right.
But overseas, people looked at what was done and they said, oh, maybe we need to regulate interconnection. So in Korea, 2 years ago, they passed legislation, the Internet Interconnection Regulation, that tries to get fair interconnection. Now, somehow fair interconnection means that the big three Korean ISPs get to charge more to interconnect to them than everybody else. Worse, they set the price for that interconnection. They put a government tax on top. You can't just have free peering anymore. You have to both sides have to pay each other, even if they're agreed that they'd have peering. And then there's a tax on that payment. And then they've set the amount which the price can go down for the next 5 years. So each year the price can only go down 7.4%.
So much for competition driving prices down.
But the logic was, oh, the US is applying telephone rules. We'll do what we used to do with the telephone to the internet. Now, we're pushing very hard to get that fixed, but these things that we're doing here have echoes everywhere else, and they're usually much worse echoes than we see here.
So I had the experience of being in a debate about zero rating, and this particular debate was in Mumbai, and and a lot of Indian public policy advocates were telling me what the FCC Open Internet Order said. And I had read the order, and it did not say what they said it said. For example, they said that the FCC had outlawed subsidized data and had outlawed what we call zero rating. And it was quite clear that the FCC, the American regulator, had allowed for experimentation in that space, had allowed for experimentation in subsidies. And there's a good reason that they allowed it. If you looked at the record of comments, there were people who expressed concern about possible anti-competitive aspects of subsidy. And certainly you can subsidize services in ways that are anti-competitive. Nobody disputes that. But there were also subsidies that were really aimed at increasing internet access for underserved populations, which might be low-income populations in cities, or they might be rural populations, or they might be people who have special needs and so on. And so there was some openness in the order, but a couple of things happened. One was that some regulators internationally, certainly in India, looked at that and said, and they didn't really follow that part of the discussion, they said, well, we just aren't going to discriminate and you aren't going to subsidize. And it's too hard for us to think about a regime in which we do ex post analysis which they said ex post and ex ante a lot, so I'm not going to say it anymore today. But they would say, we don't want to do after the fact analysis because it's too hard. It's too hard. So we're just going to have a categorical ban on subsidies. And India has a huge underserved or non-served population. So you have to figure out the economics of how you're going to get to the last mile in those people. And the other thing was that even data subsidies, the way subsidies have worked in the United States, it's not all government money going into a government pot that then gets paid out. Sometimes it's allowing competitive services to figure out internally how to subsidize building infrastructure and providing lower cost access. And we allow that. We have allowed it in telephone services for my entire lifetime. Yeah. And beyond, by the way. So if we learned anything from telephone services, surely we learned that you allow some internal subsidies some of the time. So I want to know if you want to respond to that too.
Just real quickly, there's been a lot of attention paid to what's gone on in India with regard to zero rating. There hasn't been as much attention paid to what went on in Chile.
Right.
In Chile, some of the cellular companies provided zero rating for Wikipedia and a few other services. And the regulator came in and they used a very hard definition of net neutrality and said, no, that's zero rating. We don't allow zero rating. People went into the streets, and not 15 people, but thousands of people protesting that they want their Wikipedia back. And so there is another side to this.
Well, in fact, and I was general counsel for several years for Wikipedia. And believe me, don't get the Wikipedians mad at you, because a lot of people who didn't know they were Wikipedians suddenly realize they were when they don't have access to free Wikipedia. And that's an interesting case because Wikipedia is not a commercial service. It's not competing with anyone. I may have been competing with Encyclopedia Britannica, but not in any, first of all, it won that competition. But secondly, it's really not trying to rake in money that Encyclopedia Britannica subscribers used to pay. It actually is a nonprofit. And the goal of it is very altruistic. It's providing the world's information to the world for free. And so if you were going to subsidize something, we would think, because we believe in things like human progress and democracy, and Mike Nelson's an optimist, and this is probably one of the things that makes him optimistic. We believe that if you get this information into people's hands, it enables them to participate more fully in democratic progress. So, but that also involves making distinctions between what Wikipedia is doing and maybe what for-pay music service is doing, and whether there's competition in that space. So back in 2012, when I first took a stab at writing about this, I think I had the idea that like services ought to be charged the same way, but you could tier among services so that high bandwidth services might be treated equally within their tier.
Right.
Where a video competitor to YouTube should be treated like YouTube. Whatever deal YouTube gets, anybody else should be able to get that deal.
If I can provide an example from Cloudflare. Right. When we go into countries and we want to put a data center in, normally we're met with open arms by the telecom regulator and the incumbent telco, because we're coming in and we're saying, we're going to put a data center here, and our technology is going to block all that bad traffic that your telco doesn't want to carry.
Right.
So just interconnect to us and we'll get rid of all that unnecessary traffic. And win-win. A lot of countries, they just do it for free. But in Korea, they want to treat everything the same. And so since we're going to get connected and bring a lot of bits to town, they want to treat us the same way they would treat Netflix. We're saving them costs. Netflix is coming in and saying, we want all this capacity for 5 or 6 hours every night, which means that the telco is going to have to build a huge amount of capacity for that limited time period. And yet, if they're treating all bits alike, they want to charge the same for both situations. And it doesn't make any sense at all.
And it goes above and beyond the amount of bandwidth being consumed. It's when. It's also the type. I mean, we talk Wikipedia is the type of information. What if Wikipedia had a video based platform where all of the information of the world was in video, and that's a higher
bandwidth. In fact,
right?
and we were quite aware of that. So one of the things, when I came on to Wikimedia Foundation in 2007, the way this problem actually emerged for me and the way I got really deep into it was actually through trademark law. You wouldn't think this, but the reason was that the iPhone had been introduced in 2007. Happy 10th anniversary iPhone, everybody. But the iPhone had been introduced in 2007, and when they opened up the apps platform, a lot of individual developers said, well, I have this free resource, Wikipedia, I'm going to do the app version, and Wikipedia lends itself to that because it's very text-heavy. Text is very efficient in a lot of ways for getting content out. So they would offer Wikipedia app, and then they would brand with our trademarked Wikipedia marks. And so users, I wasn't like policing this because I was really the only lawyer who worked for Wikipedia at that time. They've replaced me now with 10 people, which I feel very good about in a way. But I was the only lawyer there, and users, Wikipedia editors would come to me and they said, they're co-branding us, they're free writing on our brand, and they may not be offering it for free like we want. And so I contacted them, but what I realized was that I saw in 2007 that there was going to be this explosive growth in mobile platforms, and that low bandwidth, comparatively low bandwidth, was going to be a requirement, at least for the initial wave of adoption of smartphones as the transition to smartphones began. And so what I ended up doing is, instead of talking to the apps developers about not using our marks, I said, how would you like to work for us? How would you like to co-brand with us? How would you like to, be the official Wikipedia app, on the app stores? And they not everybody liked that, but some did, and that turns out to be the dominant app for Wikipedia. So that was sort of, and then of course I thought about it in the context of underserved and unserved populations, for most of whom, at least in the foreseeable future, we think some version of mobile is going to be their entry point into the larger internet. Do you guys have any comments or thoughts about that? It's just an infrastructure question.
Yeah,
really.
I think I got to that earlier. I think that wireless and inexpensive mobile devices, not $1,000 iPhones, but inexpensive mobile devices have the opportunity there.
I'm going to tie your example to a question you posed earlier, which is how can the infrastructure providers, how do the network service providers make money?
Yeah.
And I think we can answer that question by looking at what's happening elsewhere. In Europe in particular, we've seen a lot of cases where people have found ways to make money. Sometimes they're partnering with people. There are business cases that work, and then there are companies that aren't running themselves very well and haven't maximized profit, haven't trimmed down where they need to. So it's a matter of being smart, and infrastructure companies will make money.
Well, it's interesting.
Particularly as the technology gets cheaper and cheaper. I mean, if you can't make money when the inputs are getting cheaper and cheaper at 20 or 30% a year, then you're not planning very well.
Well, there's one other interesting. I like how many layers of complication this stuff involves. So forgive me if I get too much into the layers, and you can unpack any of this if you want to. But one of the things that one of the things that Facebook stumbled on when they were promoting zero rating services in India, and maybe in some other countries, but certainly in India, was that they originally conceived of hand-picking low bandwidth services, and they thought they had to serve feature phones, because for all that the iPhone introduced, the top of the line iPhone introduced today is a $1,000 phone. The fact is, all the smartphones in the field potentially are going to move down in price and reach different layers of the economy, and there'll be second and third owners, but there'll be smartphones. The feature phone feature phones now seem like a quirk in developed countries. If you only carry a feature phone, so there's something wrong with that guy, is what some people, not me, but some people will say. I actually respect people's choices because I'm libertarian in that way. But I think that the price points of the end user devices are going to come down, but then the question is, how do we build the infrastructure to support the increased number of users and the increased bandwidth? In your dreams, what does the world look like 5 years from now and 10 years from now? Or actually just pick 10 years from now in terms of connectivity in terms of the regulatory environment and in terms of inclusion and access?
Yeah, I mean, look, before I go there, I mean, I do think that from a regulatory perspective, there has to be a strong partnership between governments and companies that are trying to make money. I mean, it has to be a partnership. And in our case, the topic of open internet and the neutral internet, you know, there has to be a partnership between the cable companies, the content providers, the hosting companies, and government. So, in my dream, and don't forget, you know, we have this thing that's called IoT that's coming on us. It's not just devices and whatnot. This is a deluge of data that we haven't tackled on this panel. Maybe it's another panel, but there's a deluge of data that is coming our way. Everything is smart. Everything's talking back, feeding back information. And then
It's the IOHM, the Internet of Heart Monitors.
that is too. Yeah, right. I mean, and we serve those customers. I mean, we serve those customers. You know, smart TVs are everywhere. You know, one of the IoT devices that people don't think about. You know, you change channels. You know, you buy stuff. You know, I mean, this is, you know, it's so. In 5 to 10 years, I think you're going to have a mixture of medium by which to get data in and get data back. I think there's going to be some kind of a hybrid mixture of wireless, cell phone, potentially satellite, all kind of working in tandem to serve you at any point, at any place on planet Earth. And I do think that in 10 years, that, you know, we're going to be marching towards that reality. We just touched on a lot of international regulations. I think that's going to start to normalize. The Korea model is going to start to normalize to and be the outlier, because those, you know, because this is an international battle, and those kind of weird outliers will normalize to some kind of a global standard.
I'm kind of upset because you got to mention IoT before I did. I was just about to jump into this, because I think it does change the dynamic, and it changes the profit loss situation for some of the telcos. I think one thing it means is we're probably going to see a lot more fiber to the neighborhood, and then very high-speed wireless for the last 100 meters or 200, 500 meters. And I think that's a great thing, because I think that's really what we need in most places. But satellite's going to be the answer for the last 1% or the last 2% in the States, and probably more so in other countries. TV white space, there's technologies that can do the different pieces of this, as long as the networks all interconnect and interconnect fairly and in a competitive way. But I don't like talking about the Internet of Things either. First off, it violates Nelson's first rule of buzzwords, which is you only get 3 or 4 syllables. You know, Iron Curtain, that's a good buzzword. It lasted for 50 years. Cloud of Things is the right way to think about this, because we really need to think about the whole system, and that's the way we're going to build a profitable market for all the different players in the cloud of things, rather than just focusing on the movement of the bits.
You said 10 years, right?
Yeah.
So 10 years ago, there was no iPhone.
Correct.
So 10 years from now, I mean, to me, the most interesting thing about all of this isn't so much, I think the network and the way we serve customers and get network that last mile is going to evolve based entirely and be entirely driven by the usage patterns of customers, of people. And IoT, I think, is certainly a part of that. But think about the way that people use the internet today versus the way they did 10 years ago, right? I think mobile is obviously continuing to become more and more and more and more important. I think the amount of consumption of video on mobile is really interesting to me. I never thought, like, oh yeah, people are gonna be watching movies on their little teeny tiny screens. I remember when Apple introduced the iPod video with the tiny little screen. I thought that was the dumbest thing I'd ever seen. But people love having their devices with them, and I think we're going to have a higher and higher degree of expectation of more and more bandwidth at lower and lower prices wherever the hell we are in the world, and that's going to drive everything.
Can I check something here?
Yeah.
You don't have the Ethernet port into the
No, I don't.
brainstem
No,
yet.
I
You
don't.
Do you have one? I've got one. In 10 years, why not?
Yeah, I maybe want a more secure.
Security is, I think, actually a much more interesting question than how we're going to get network everywhere when it comes to the proliferation of devices that are connected.
Right. I think I want to leave some access problems a little more difficult for hackers to solve. So we have time for maybe one or two questions. And if there aren't any questions, believe me, we can fill the time that we have. But are there any pressing questions? Sure. No one else is going to. Sure. Okay. Very good. So we've got about 2 minutes. So ask your question, keeping in mind that we're going to answer in 2 minutes.
Okay. So I'm wondering, what's your thoughts on you've talked about IoT, but not mesh networking and other distributed technologies. Is there a place for that in solving these issues, and what is it?
So what's the question? Well, if you heard it, question about mesh technologies and other more distributed technologies for access. I think obviously mesh technologies or analogous technologies are going to be central to access going forward, or they're increasingly important outside of the typical infrastructural backbones. And the reason I think this is that all of our devices are smarter and they all have more storage on them. So it makes sense to kind of use the processing power and informational storage to take even distributed, narrow, hit and miss connections and maximize how effectively those are used. So I see that as targets of opportunity, and there may be different applications may push the envelope in these distributed networks in different ways, but that's sort of what I would guess.
I'm just waiting for somebody to take this little thing. This is a miracle machine, but
Right.
it doesn't do mesh. And after Hurricane Irma, and particularly what
kind of really
happened
wanted to
in
do
the
it.
Caribbean, it would have been really nice to have these devices talking to each other and creating ad hoc networks. And that is possible. It's easy. It's not expensive, but there's a huge incentive by the telcos not to do that.
Yep.
And the same thing is true, although the telcos are not producing the devices, so maybe if you put it in the device.
Well, they're not supporting things
supporting
that
it.
they would not support a device that does mesh networks.
So we've seen both successful and failed color revolutions, in which the governments in power have attempted to use their control of the regulator to either require kill switches or use kill switches if they have them. I had colleagues who were in Ukraine, at the regime change period in Ukraine, who got messages on their phones saying, "You are in the wrong place at the wrong time, and we know that you're there." And so that was very tricky. But FireChat, I guess, and other apps, there are some efforts to find ways around kind of the hub and spoke architecture of traditional telecom and internet access, and I expect to see more of that. And all these devices are really powerful radios. They have different capacity in them, and they access different parts of the spectrum, but there's no reason to think that can't or won't increase over time. I expect it to increase over time. And we're now out of time. So I would like to thank you all very much for attending our last panel of the day.